This is Chapter 7 of The Americans, Immigrants and Urbanization. The primary questions we'll be asking in Chapter 7 are: what would you do to improve conditions? How can immigrants gain access to the services they need? What skills do newcomers need? How might immigrants respond to help from an outsider? Chapter 7.1 is called The New Immigrants. The main idea of this section is that immigration from Europe, Asia, the Caribbean, and Mexico reached a new high in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. On page 254 of chapter 7.1, there's a section entitled A Personal Voice. This is an interesting personal story about the American dream that we're often told exists even today. We have to ask ourselves, if he didn't feel he had achieved the American dream, even though he was wealthy and respected, what then is the American dream? Can the American dream be achieved by all people from all backgrounds? As more and more immigrants came to the United States, new barriers were created by the government to make sure that the people who came here only fit the needs of our society. This is a change from our constitutional beginnings, which welcomed all men as being created equal. Now, because immigrants were coming from non-white, non-Western, non-Christian countries, the federal government created new immigration stations at Ellis Island and at Angel Island. On page 258, you'll see a section that describes the challenges that these new immigrants faced in an overwhelmingly white-dominated society. You'll notice that they tried to fit in. The new Polish and Italian and Chinese Americans felt increasing friction as they rubbed shoulders with people born and raised in the United States. Native-born people often disliked the immigrants' unfamiliar customs and language and viewed them as a threat to the American way of life. This is a theme in American history in which any time the dominant white Christian culture has to deal with something unfamiliar, as in a new religion or a new race, it finds it to be a threat and often persecutes that threat with discrimination and violence. One example of native-born American reaction to immigration is the rise of nativism. Nativism is the overt favoritism toward native-born Americans. The idea that only real Americans are people who were born in this country. At the bottom, you'll see how anti-Asian sentiment grows on the West Coast. Anti-Asian sentiment grows even more as the economy makes work become more scarce. And Congress even goes so far as to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned the entry of all Chinese except for students, teachers, and merchants. This is the most formally racist immigration law that the United States passes, even at the same time as it's embracing its new identity as a land of immigrants pursuing the American dream. In addition to the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese were also banned from immigrating to this country under the Gentleman's Agreement, which was worked out by Theodore Roosevelt and the Japanese government to informally limit immigration of unskilled workers from Japan. At the bottom of the page, you'll also see the vocabulary for Chapter 7, Section 1. Please continue to make vocabulary flashcards to help you study. Chapter 7, Section 2 of The Americans is entitled The Challenges of Urbanization. The main idea for this section is that the rapid growth of cities forced people to contend with the problems of housing, transportation, water, and sanitation. As immigrants begin to settle into the city, reaction from groups that were already established in major American cities reflects the racism and anti-immigrant feeling that was common across the United States. The Americanization movement is one example of this racist response. It was designed to assimilate people of wide-ranging cultures into the dominant culture. Just as we had tried with the Native Americans to erase their culture, now we were going to require all new immigrants to the United States to leave behind their language, their traditions, their religion, and blend themselves into the white Christian-dominated society of the United States. Urban problems are detailed here on page 264, among them being housing, transportation, water, and sanitation. The housing problems are summarized when they built new tenements or overcrowded multi-family urban dwellings. Mass transit is introduced in the late 19th century with streetcars in San Francisco, electric subways in Boston. The problem of water was a major issue for most cities around the nation as they struggled to bring water into these new tenements and to provide drinking water and plumbing for the people who lived inside. Sanitation was one of the major problems of these new cities because with the influx of new people, the amount of human waste and disease that waste carried with it became a major public health problem. Two other major urban problems are detailed on page 265, and those are crime and fire. The problem of crime leads to the organization of the first full-time police forces, first in New York City and then in other major cities like Chicago. Fire remains a major problem in most cities around the world, and in cities like Chicago and in San Francisco, we have two examples of how fires ultimately wiped out major portions of those cities. In reaction to the problems of urbanization and immigration, reformers begin to mobilize across the country, seeking to ease the plight of the immigrants and to address the problems that major cities had in dealing with this large new population. Groups like the social gospel movement established settlement houses that helped new immigrants find housing and work, as well as educated them in new jobs and in how to speak English. They were led by leaders like Jane Addams, one of the most influential of all the social gospel leaders. At the bottom of page 266, please notice there are more vocabulary terms to add to your growing list of vocabulary flashcards. Chapter 7.3 is entitled Politics in the Gilded Age, and the main idea of this section is that local and national political corruption in the 19th century led to calls for reform. Politics in the 19th century became one of corruption and political machines in which a small number of cities could ultimately control the national political situation by delivering the votes of uninformed or uneducated immigrants who didn't understand how American democracy worked. A closer look on page 267 at one American's story reveals the emergence of a new name, but a famous name in American history, that of Mark Twain, who in his novel, The Gilded Age, summarized this time period in American history. In fact, the title of that book, The Gilded Age, is often used to describe the late 19th century. Politics in the late 19th century is symbolized by the political machine, which is discussed at the top of page 268. New immigrants to cities from European countries that had no tradition of democracy had no problem selling their votes to political machines in exchange for jobs or for even something as simple as a new apartment or, in some cases, food. On page 269, you'll read about municipal graft and scandal. Municipal graft is essentially corruption on a citywide level. political machines would often award a contract to a local businessman to supply any service the city needed. And that political businessman would then give a little bit of the money he made from that contract to the mayor or to other members in the political machine. Well, the money that was given in that contract is the money that belongs to the people of the city who had to pay taxes to their government to get that service, were ultimately paying way too much for that service. Here you'll see the most famous of all political bosses, Boss Tweed, who ran New York City's Tammany Hall in the late 19th century. And his example of political graft was a project that cost taxpayers $13 million, the construction of the New York County Courthouse in New York City. The actual construction cost was just $3 million. The $10 million difference went to Boss Tweed and his followers. The problem of political corruption in government ultimately consumes the presidency of three different presidents: Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, and Chester A. Arthur. And ever since the time of Andrew Jackson, most of the government jobs were given away as patronage to people who supported the president. Knowing that reform of the civil service was important to having a democracy in the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes tried to clean out the notoriously corrupt portions of the government. However, this upset many of his supporters in the Republican Party. And it upset them so much that Hayes decided not even to try to run for re-election in 1880, knowing that the political bosses in the Republican Party would fight his re-election nomination, ultimately leading to an embarrassing political fight for the party. When he doesn't run for re-election, James Garfield ultimately becomes the President of the United States. He's an independent Republican who doesn't owe any loyalty to the political bosses in the Republican Party that dominated the northern cities of the United States. However, those political bosses got their friend Chester A. Arthur to be voted in as vice president. Garfield didn't want to continue with the corrupt practices that Andrew Jackson had started and began to take apart the patronage system. And he was shot by Charles Guiteau, who had wanted a political job but was denied that political job. James Garfield was assassinated so that Chester A. Arthur could become president. Business buys influence. This section describes the election of Grover Cleveland to the White House, the first Democrat to hold the presidency in 28 years, going back to before the Civil War. Grover Cleveland's presidency was dominated by an issue over tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. Business leaders in the United States wanted higher taxes on imported goods from Europe. They did not want to compete in a capitalist system. They wanted to control it. And the president needed to raise taxes for these businessmen to control capitalism in the United States. Grover Cleveland tried to do just the opposite. He tried to lower the taxes on imported goods. Congress, being controlled by big business, refused to support lower taxes on imports, and they refused to support free market capitalism. Cleveland runs for re-election on a low tariff platform against Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of former President William Henry Harrison. Now, what's interesting about the election of 1888 is that Grover Cleveland actually got more votes than Benjamin Harrison. But because the Electoral College is made up of people in the national government, big business was able to deliver more votes in the Electoral College for Benjamin Harrison. Big business stole the election for their own candidate and denied the candidate that was given more votes by the American people. Chapter 7, Section 3 ends with a vocabulary list right here. Please add these terms to your growing collection of vocabulary flashcards.